Hello, and welcome to the first ever video of the Mythopedia. I'm your host, Joey Levesby, and today we're going to be talking about a fun topic. Norse myth, which I'm realizing in the camera it's going to be backwards. I don't give a shit. Now, the thing about Norse myth, for a long time, Norse religion has been seen as a unique pantheon of gods that evolved parallel to the Greco-Roman religion that we kind of know today. However, the more research that is done into the origins of the Viking religion, the more it becomes clear that this is not the case. It's a lot messier than that, and instead it provides a fascinating insight into the evolution of religion as we know it, and the ways cultural exchange and conversion are a much longer process than believed. So, grab up coffee, pull up a chair, and let's talk mythology. I am a dwarf and a digging a hole. The first and most important name to know when it comes to Norse mythology is my boy, love of my life, light of my world, Snorri Sturluson. Now, Snorri is an interesting figure. He's one of the only firm names we really have in the history of this religion, mainly because he is thought to be the author or compiler, more likely anything, the compiler of the Prose Edda. What is the Prose Edda? The Prose Edda, the Eddas, as a whole are, well, confusing. Confusing as hell. And Snorri's Edda is one of the oldest Scandinavian accounts or Icelandic accounts of their own religion and beliefs. However, it doesn't come to us until around 1220 AD. Now, Snorri himself was born in 1179 and died around 1242 or 1241 AD. So post-Christianization, a very important thing to remember for all of this is that the official conversion of the Norse people, 1000 AD. That is when official, or CE, depending on what you care about. That is the official the official date of conversion. Now, this is being written 200 years after the country has been converted. So, essentially prefaces by claiming that Norse myth is a fabrication from the Aesir, who are the Aesir, as you may be aware from things like Marvel movies, or if you've ever done reading into the Norse myth. The Aesir and the Vanir are the two god groups there. Snorri immediately starts to throw wrenches into our understanding of things by claiming these are either Asian people who have convinced the Scandinavians that they're gods, or people from Troy who did that. Already, off the bat, with the equation of Norse gods as coming from Troy, you can already see how our ideas of this religion being homogeneous or monolithic in its development outside of Christianity, Roman belief and practices are present hundreds of years after the fall of Rome in this Icelandic text. And not even just Roman beliefs, Greco-Roman beliefs. Ideas from all the way back in Homer are coming into Scandinavian practice hundreds and hundreds of years later. So a lot of people have a hard time taking Snorri fully for his word. His epic is fascinating. It is one of the best accounts we have of the Norse religion. However, Snorri was 100% trying to unify the Icelandic people. He had strong ties to the King of Norway, and it was believed he was trying to essentially unify Iceland in order to swear fealty to Norway. But in order to do that, his kind of goal was to create this more centralized religious identity. So you see immediately when it comes to things like the Poetic Edda, there are some lines from it that really stand out as evidence that this is a post-Christianization, Romanization source. Snorri at one point, referring to Thor, there was one who is called Thor, and he is Asa, Thor the Old. He is Oku Thor, and to him are ascribed the great deeds drawn by Hector in Troy. But men think that the Turks have told of Ulysses and have called him Loki. So the idea that Thor is just Hector of Troy and Loki is just Odysseus or Ulysses of Greece, well, in this case Turkey, is already this sense of Hellenization of their own mythology, not just Christianization. So, I'm gonna have to, the audio is gonna be all over the place. I apologize. the prose Edda from our boy Snorri is framed as. Gosh, I have it here. I need to get this right because these are Norse names that I'm dumb about. The proper name of it, the Norse name of it, and I don't speak Norse, so I'm going to pronounce things wrong. But that's on purpose because you're gonna yell at me in the comments, and that's fucking engagement. That's all I need from you bastards. So I'm going to say it wrong. No, I'm not. I'm going to try to say it right. At least the beginning opening story of Snorri is called the Gylfaginning, or the tricking of Gylfi. And this basically the story is this Swedish king Gylfi. It gets tricked by a Asa woman who he's like, yeah, I'll give you some land and as much as oxen can till. So she gets giant oxen and pulls out an entire section into the sea and creates sea land, and that's her place now, which queen for that. He's basically like, oh cool, I'm gonna go talk to these Aesir because they seem pretty strong. So he goes and he finds them, and you can tell it's very different than the older sources because it doesn't like to use proper names. It's very careful about the way it does those types of things, and it frames everything like you could doubt it. It describes the Asa as being aware that he's coming, so they almost put on a show for him to make themselves appear more godlike. But that's conjecture. And so the tricking of Gylfinger involves Gylfi going to the Asa, and essentially Odin is represented in a trinity. Which already, there is evidence that in his own mythology, he had two brothers, and some of his major events were done in threes, but the way that they're described by Snorri is they're not even given proper titles. It's just the head of the gods, who you have to assume is Odin. And they are called, translated from Norse, I don't remember the Norse name, but they translate to highest one, just as high, and third, which, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And in some cases, they're represented as Odin, Thor, and Frey, aka a father, a son, and a weird secondary, third figure who is connected but more naturey and spiritual than the other two. The main kind of way that the tricking of Gylfi works, it is a framing narrative. So it is a myth that allows for the telling of other myths, and it essentially is just tracing the Norse timeline from creation to Ragnarok. So my boy Snorri is very useful for seeing how the Icelandic religion died. It is almost a obituary to what their final perspective on the Norse gods were, or at least where it was at near the end, which is extremely useful, but it's not as useful for our purposes here today of trying to understand how the Norse religion evolved. So to do that, we need essentially better sources. But that's where our lovely, lovely little friend, the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda. The Codex Regius, I would put the name of the author on the board, but that's the fun part about the Codex Regius. We got no freaking clue who made it. For a while it was believed to be Samed the Learned, but that is not true. It's not possible. So it's not him. It was likely a collection of people. It's both Snorri's Edda and the Poetic Eddas are very similar to the Odyssey and the Iliad in a way. We believe it was written around 1200 or 1100 AD, but it was found around 1600 AD by it wasn't found by the bishop, but the bishop came in possession of it. Likely edited it, did some work on it, sent it to the king. King's book. The thing about the Krogenbach, about the King's book, the Codex Regius, my love, it drives me insane because it reveals a very key factor that is the rabbit hole of this mythology. We don't know when these stories came about or existed, so we can't actually track what is been part of the uniform religion and what hasn't been. So the Codex Regius, I honestly prefer when looking at Norse myth because it, like I said, doesn't have Snorri's input. I love Snorri, but he's a Christian. Come on. I think one of the most useful pieces of the Poetic Edda, what is called the Havamal, or the Lay of the High One, because what the Lay of the High One is a series of essentially pieces of advice from Odin to his people, which One of the key factors when studying a culture, the reason you can look at religion is because when things like religion get written down from an oral tradition to a written tradition, the things that are put down are the things that after hundreds of years have solidified into cultural cornerstones. So, especially if we see some of these cultural traits existing hundreds of years before and they're still present here, it becomes pretty clear that was a key factor of the culture. And the Lay of Odin provides just a lot of insight into the general perspectives of the culture. Because even looking at like the Varangian Guard, one of the most famous Viking kind of external cultural exchanges, basically. They'd work as guards for the Byzantine Empire emperor, who was a Christian king. Harold Hardrada did this. Famous boy. While they worked for the Byzantine Empire, most of them essentially would accept Christianity and accept the sign of the cross while they worked there, and they would leave, maybe go back to their old ways, because to them it was literally just a job. And you work for a Christian, you have to be Christian, so you say you're Christian for a few years. You can see why stuff like that was not only allowed, but encouraged when they have, when part of the Havamal, the Lay of Odin, describes pieces of advice. Know if thou has a friend whom thou fully trustest, and from whom thou wouldst good derive, thou shouldst blend thy mind with his, and gifts exchange, and often go to see him. Essentially saying, if you have someone that you see as a good friend who you fully trust, then you should try to think like them, discuss things with them, be of one mind on things, and provide gifts and good relations, visit them often. But immediately following this is a line that says, if thou hast another whom thou little trustest, yet would good from him derive, thou shouldst speak him fair, but think craftily, and leasing pay with lying. Essentially saying, if there's another person you don't trust as much, but you still want good from, watch your words around them and make sure if they lie to you, you meet them with the same kind of lies. But it is saying, if you kind of don't trust someone, you should still try to get stuff out of them. You should still try to maintain good relations. And the most fascinating one that I think is so perfect at encapsulating how this culture differed than a lot of others is the 46th piece of advice. But of him yet further, whom thou little trustest, and thou suspect his affections, before him thou shouldst laugh, and contrary to thy thoughts speak, requited should the gift resemble. It is literally a piece of advice that says to its people, if there is someone who you don't like or trust, but they seem to like you, lie to their face. Be who they think you are, so that you can continue to have good relations and positive gifts with them. Now, that is, I think, is such an important cultural context. But the Lay of the High One, the entire thing gives a lot of very interesting cultural insights. Well, okay, we don't know when anything in it came from, and all of it had to come within a few hundred years of the 800s. Not the 800s, yeah, the 800s, or the 1000s. So all of that to say, it's a very useful source, but it's not as old as we can go. And when we're trying to figure out the origins of a religion, you gotta go old, baby, old. Now, what's older than the Poetic Eddas? Well, we don't have any Norse or Icelandic or any Scandinavian sources that are older, that are written. Essentially, pre-Christian evidence is used to corroborate the pagan ideas presented in Snorri and his work, and the Codex Regius. In order to more corroborate these and to know that what these kind of things were solidifying, we can look at older historical texts that essentially reveal more about the culture than the religion. So some of the oldest written texts we have on this, not from them, is actually our big boy, the big J-man himself, not Jesus, Caesar, Julius, because that boy loved to learn things, not in a good way. Well, not in a good way. So there's this lovely thing, Interpretatio Greco, or Interpretatio Romana, which is the interpretation of the Romans, the interpretation of the Greek. That is why the Norse gods are, not Norse, the Roman gods are so similar to the Greek gods, this concept of interpretation. Now, fun fact that I finding this gave me a headache. It's not going to come on the audience. It gave me a headache. It gave me a headache to learn about, because the thing is, I knew this, but I didn't know the extent of this. The the Etruscan religion is where things like Mercury and Jupiter come from. And for a long time, it's like, oh, the Etruscans, the Romans come from Greece, so it makes sense their gods are similar. No! The Etruscans were there first. Mercury's stupid, because Mercury comes from another outside source that then was influenced into the Etruscans, but then also the Romans did that too, and then, okay, but that's besides the point. Jupiter was there first in the Etruscans, but not in the Romans. The Etruscan religion was there first. The Romans came in, and as the emergence of the Roman Empire entered into things, Hellenization occurred of the Etruscan Italian religion. And that is when things like Jupiter being associated with Zeus, and Mercury being associated with Hermes evolves. But basically, Caesar writes about them all the way back in our lovely, lovely day, 55 BCE. Now remember, Christianization takes place 1000 AD. Our boy, the Big J Man, is there in 55 BC. And he basically is writing more about Gaul than Germanic tribes. He's kind of silly, goofy man. He describes how like the Druid practice isn't exactly existing. I think he's more talking about Gaul, though. But it's important to remember that when the Romans take over Gaul in roughly 170, that's not when they take over. Confirmed trade connections emerge around 2nd century, 200 AD. And it's exactly that kind of thing. And Tacitus, when he comes later and actually goes to the Germanies, and Tacitus's Germania is where we see him equate Odin to Mercury. Now, Tacitus's Germania takes place in 98 AD, almost over 100 years after Caesar. And the thing about 100 years is it means that people change. And you can already see some of the differences in religion at the time. And there's some very clear evidence that the Norse culture was not homogeneous as it's almost presented. For the most part, that was not the case. They had shared, ideas, but, different cities had their different patron gods. And Tacitus describes how all of these different tribes have their different gods, different funerary practices and rites, different religious rites. And Tacitus even explicitly states that the Norse religion does not have idols, figures. They do not have indoor worship. They only really worship at groves or natural places. However, another source from the same era, Ibn Fadlan, a Muslim explorer who is in what would be modern day, I think, Bulgaria, encountered the Rus, who were a Viking group from Sweden who were in the rivers of the Volga, and he witnessed some of the religious practice. That's actually where we have our first record of a burning ship burial from our boy Ibn Fadlan. He also describes their religious practice. In the moment they land, they leave the ship and go to a carved figure of a man leaving offerings and asking their lord for help. So, in the first century, we are seeing how these cultures is not uniform. We have evidence that these cultures are not uniform. The greatest forms of development come from inter-exchange or problems, kind of. When Rome moves in, and when they start to be asked, essentially, when Tacitus and when Caesar are asking these people, who are your gods? What do you worship? Why do you worship him? Why him? They had to answer. And they had to start forming a more uniform identity and start to coalesce more in order to create and to maintain their own identity rather than being subsumed by the giant Roman Empire right next to them. However, I don't want to give too much credit to the Romans because everyone gives every fucking thing to the Romans. They didn't do everything, okay? But they are influencing each other, and it is almost impossible to deny that they are influencing each other, especially on the edges of these religions. It is a much more soft and malleable practice. They're willing to take on other beliefs if it's beneficial or if it means securing a better trade. Influence, it happens. Yeah, and so we know they've been in direct contact from the 170s, diplomats. We know diplomats and missionaries were going in around the 3rd and 4th century. So before Christianization takes full hold, there is still diplomatic relations and connections and influence culturally from each other. So the Norse religion is already evolving parallel to Roman religion at this point. And it's even thought that runic writing evolved as a hybrid of Latin and Old Scandinavian, or Old Norse writing. And so the very magic of their religion, the runic magic, comes from a possible Latin hybrid. And so the more and more it becomes clear that Norse myth is not unique and homogeneous, but is still a fascinating exploration of how these things evolve. And another fascinating thing of how we can affirm that some of these practices are older than the Christianized sources. And one of the oldest things we have is the best tree on earth, Yggdrasil, the fucking world tree. Big boy. Yggdrasil is one of the oldest and one of the most shared perspectives from all of these religions. But it's not until around 200 AD that we start to see these tricorn kind of stone settings that are thought to represent or be indicative of Yggdrasil, the world tree. And it's not until it's around that same time that these ring forts emerge, which have like a central post and 9 gates, which is thought to represent Yggdrasil itself and the gateway to the 9 realms. So, we don't see these physical evidences of their cultural beliefs until they start having a lot more encounters with the Romans. Cultural self-preservation. And even more fascinatingly, as time continues and Rome gets converted to Christianity, we see those influences come in long before missionaries show up. So it's by the 5th century, worship had shifted from outdoor space to indoor space. So this is a big fucking thing. This is a big thing. Mainly because around the exact same time is when Rome officially converts to Christianity, and beforehand, Rome's religion is an outdoor religion. It has these massive, beautiful temples, but that's outside kind of beauty, and the insides were mainly just used for storage of artifacts and things like that. The altars were outdoors in an area next to all the temples, and that's where the sacrifices and things happened, was the outdoor spaces. But then Christianity comes in, the churches come in, basilicas, and suddenly worship's indoors. And we see at this exact same time, the Norse cult houses evolve. And suddenly, Norse religion shifts from sacred groves and spaces to longhouses in specific places in the town that is used for this worship. And the fact that these two things happen at once, or in the same 100-year span, it's very difficult to ignore. Especially when they're so close to each other. And while it may not be a direct inspiration, it could very clearly be just this type of how, as culture develops, have to kind of centralize. And so if it doesn't indicate some cultural influence from each other, it shows that the world was centralizing, and that there was no group, at least in this area, who was isolated or free from that. And as worship shifts from an outdoor space to an indoor space, once again, beliefs get solidified even more, because you're not just talking about the gods anymore. You're not just having ideas. Suddenly, you're having motifs on the wall. You're having artwork. You're having a centralized area in town where people can go to regularly, and these stories need to be more clear, more established, more direct. So in the way that writing kind of puts everything down for the first time, having a space for worship and for artwork gives these stories a lot of physical touchstones and anchors. So they become a lot more uniform and a lot clearer to both us and the people. Some of the key factors of how we recognize some of these gods don't emerge until this time. Like nowadays we recognize Odin by his spears, his raven, his horse, which I love the story of his horse. Loki gets empregged. It's fucking amazing. That doesn't emerge until these cult houses start to happen, where those types of representations can actually be kept. So the solidified ideas of the gods emerge at the same time as these cult houses, which means that we don't exactly know what they were beforehand, but we can have ideas. One of the most interesting factors or things of Roman Christian influence or Christian Norse influence is there's a very fascinating archaeological find. I think it was Trendholm it was found. I should double check that. But it was a mold of a cross and a Thor's hammer found in the same blacksmith mold, which implied that the blacksmith of the area had a reason to regularly produce both. Some of the oldest Thor's hammer pendants that we find are from the 9th century, which was exactly when Christian missionary work started. So it's almost believed that the Mjolnir hammer evolved as a response to the Christian cross. In a way, they'd see the Christian with the cross, and they'd be like, well, we got ours. We know who we are. And the fact that these were being cast at the same time, in the same molds, the Norse religion was very willing to accept these things as long as they weren't being told to leave their old gods. And as I've discussed, there's reason for that. It's clear that their culture was one willing to take in other ideas and consider other perspectives. These symbols of their faith evolved in direct response to Christianity. And so, well, Thor's hammer and the lore of Mjolnir definitely existed for hundreds of years beforehand. I mean, even way back in Tacitus in 98 AD, Thor was being equated to Hercules, or Heracles. So even then, there was this famous, hero of the people. But we don't see the encouraged solidification of these practices until outside sources push against. And they have to create this more centralized idea of themselves. And so, I know I mentioned it earlier, but kind of the main point of all of this, the reason that it took me forever to explain everything about snoring and get to this point, because I needed it to be understood where our scholarship is and why it is so much of a rabbit hole to go down. Because, when the final Christianization comes, they have been being influenced by other religions for hundreds of years. All the way from the Bronze Age, where they're being influenced by Hellenistic ideas. By the time that the 1000 AD rolls around, this is a culture that has been used to interacting with others for a long time, used to conceding some things for the trade, doing what's necessary for the art of the deal. And so it's not difficult to see why the transition was pretty smooth. A lot of the only times there was any real violence was when they were being told they couldn't still have their old gods. So this idea of the bloodthirsty, pagan, heathen Viking, the Norseman who would rather die than give up Odin, will die with a sword in their hand to get to Valhalla. You can get to Valhalla and praise Jesus too. I mean, come on. In conclusion, Norse mythology, fascinating field of study. It is one of the three big religions that are studied in the Western world, with Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Norse. And for a long time, these were seen as homogeneous theologies that are almost in combat with one another. But as we research these cultures and religions more, we're seeing that was never the case. Theology was never distinct from culture. It has always been a soft boundary that evolves like any other aspect of, human society. It is how we understand the world around us. It's how we understand our past. It's how we understand our friends, our family, how we justify the pieces of advice we're given, how we justify who we are and how we function in the world. So as the world changes, these things change too. And it's important to remember that when talking about Norse myth or Greek myth or Roman myth or any type of religion or mythology, you have to remember the dates and the evolution. At the end of the day, the most important thing to remember about Norse mythology, the first and primary thing we know is that we don't know anything. Everything is conjecture, and that's almost what makes it fun. So, I hope you found this interesting. I hope it made sense. I hope my audio worked, and I hope I have given you an interest in Norse myth. Thank you for watching and listening, and cheers. Fuck me.
I hope my audio works.